So I think I heard loudly and clearly that patient engagement is really important. And I think before we get to the just one piece, we might want to add the word patient into this decision aid throughout some point in time. And perhaps even in the second one, as we think about how the trial results are going to be applied, we need to think not only about applied for an FDA decision or a payer decision, but also for patient and family caregiver decisions. So with that, let's transition also to another decision maker, which is FDA. And so Peter, if you could share your perspective, not only at FDA, but I know you have a long history at several companies as well developing these trials.
Great, thank you very much. And that was very relevant to the discussion then, so we're glad we were on the same panel. So to start with my disclaimer, although I'm at the FDA, my opinions and comments may not necessarily reflect the views of the FDA, but my own. I'll start by just saying that this does matter a great deal to us. The 21st Century Cures, and I think even before that, really reflects a commitment to developing our understanding and our application of real-world evidence. And Rob Califf earlier pointed out that it's not just observational, but randomized trials in the context of clinical practices in real-world settings, and learning how to do that and how treatment should be modulated in the context of these trials is really important to us. And I think the discussion that I hope we'll have in the next hour, I think will begin to elucidate some of these factors, and I think will be a work in progress, not just for this set of issues, but for the range of issues that we touched on today. So I just want to emphasize that this really is important to us, and we really want to understand how to apply this and what we can conclude when we look at the design of trials with respect to treatment quality considerations. Well, just to step back, I think it's evident that there's a wide range of pragmatic trials. The word pragmatic trial means different things to different people, widely different things to different people. And I think that's probably partly because the designs are so diverse and the types of pragmatic trials are such a wide range that it's not a standard definition. But I think in general, the concept is that we're trying to better understand the generalizability of our treatment. That's, I think, in general why we think about pragmatic trials, although also there are cost considerations that we, I think, touched on earlier in the day as well, in terms of reducing the burden of the trial, the resource commitments, which also has substantial potential value in terms of being able to invest that resource in other development goals. So the flexibility obviously will be important in how we think about the design and application of these pragmatic trials. Now, in thinking about some of the key issues for how we manage patient treatment within the context of these trials, I think the issues are ones of what can we infer from the results of this trial. So inference, I think we've heard already, is an important consideration. How generalizable, how narrow it is. I discovered earlier, I grew up in Manhattan where sushi was my standard fare. It turns out that isn't applicable in Iowa or Louisiana. Who would know that, right? So generalizability is an important consideration and a theme today, I think, as well. So when we think about the inference, we're dealing with this trade-off between the generalizability, the external validity, and the precision of the estimate, how accurate is our estimate of efficacy and safety, the internal validity of the trial. And we have to weigh those factors with the other consideration, which is patient safety. What is appropriate in the context of a clinical trial to allow a patient to receive with regard to how treatment is implemented. So in stepping back, I wanted to think about some of the factors that would go into these decisions. And so I'm going to comment on several factors, but I think there are probably many others, and we'll look forward to the discussion to hear about some of the other considerations. But the ones that I'll touch on is, first, what is the research question? What are we trying to find out? What is the clinical context of the trial? What are the parameters of the trial and patients and the treatment that we have to think about in trying to determine this? What's the regulatory intent? Is this intended for a public health question? Is it a practice question that doesn't have a direct regulatory impact? Or is it intended for a regulatory purpose. And what about the study design? What are the elements of the study design, and how do those impact how we have to think about the way we would implement treatment? So let me step through those in a little bit more detail. Well, in terms of the research questions, again, as I said, pragmatic trials are just this wide range of things. Pragmatic doesn't necessarily mean that we're not assessing efficacy versus effectiveness. We may really want a precise estimate of efficacy, but we may want to get this in a more generalized setting. And so if we're earlier in a development program where efficacy still hasn't been established or hasn't been fully characterized, we may want a fairly precise definition of efficacy in that setting, and that may lead us to how we want to implement and monitor and manage treatment quality so that we can get the most precise estimate. I think it's generally fair to say that the less touch we put on treatment restriction, the less we manage how therapy is implemented in a trial, there is likely to be less precision around those estimates. So if we're trying to find out efficacy with precision, clearly that will modulate how we will think about implementation of the treatment. We also have to think about what the other questions might be. For example, are we trying to find out what the effectiveness or the efficacy is in a broader range of patients? We've heard that in phase 3 trials, there's concerns that it's a more restricted population because of the enrollment criteria, because of the sites in which these trials are conducted. We may not have the breadth of patients that ultimately will be on this treatment. So we may want to know more about how this works in older patients if they weren't participating in high levels in the phase 3 program, patients who have other comorbidities that maybe were excluded or maybe not excluded but simply didn't enter into the trial. We may want to look at the efficacy in patients with a broader range of the target disease than was entered into the trial. There may be very important questions which still relate to the efficacy of this agent, but look at the question of how does it work in populations that were not well characterized, and simply asking the question of efficacy, even in patients who were studied in phase 3. Phase 3 studies are relatively modest in size. We hope several thousand patients may participate in some of these trials. In some of our programs, it may be 100 patients in a phase 3 trial for a rare disease, for example. So when we can bring this out to a broader population, we can understand the characteristics, not just in patients who didn't participate, but even in those who did participate, because greater numbers give us greater understanding of efficacy and safety consideration. Do we want to understand the translatability of the trial to the real world? So is that our question? Are we trying to figure out, well, okay, in this context of a very well tightly controlled phase 3 trial, when we move this into a clinical practice setting, is it translatable? Will we be able to see similar results? Is that our research question? Or is our research question one of comparative effectiveness? How does treatment A compare to treatment B? And that may be a relatively straightforward issue if there's similar types of it, both oral tablets, easy to administer, and maybe a more complicated question if one is an oral agent, another is a sub-Q agent, or with other different administration, or with very different profiles in terms of tolerability and safety. So what is comparative effectiveness may be a very important question that we want to answer. And I think each of these issues in terms of what the research question has an impact on how we think about applying the precision of implementation of the treatment. So the second set of factors, so I talked about the research question and how that impacts this issue. I think the second set of factors is the clinical context and what is the setting in which we are doing this trial? What is the nature of the disease? Is this a progressive disease or a non-progressive disease? If we're talking about a cancer population, our tolerance for implementing a less than high standard of care quality treatment will be pretty low. If we're talking about a non-progressive treatment, particularly over the duration of the trial, we may have more tolerance for more general settings and less rigid implementation of treatment to patients. So the nature of the disease, the nature of the treatment. Is it a very simple treatment to implement, or is it a complex treatment to implement? Jim gave the example before of Coumadin. Certainly there we need to know that it will obviously not be terribly effective if it's not properly monitored, if it's not properly dosed by physicians who are highly experienced. So if our issue is to use a drug like that, we have to think about the importance of implementation and monitoring versus a very simple to administer single tablet that doesn't require monitoring and doesn't have complicated considerations in how it is administered. We have to think about the patients to be studied and their susceptibility to harm. So are we including vulnerable populations in this study? Is this a population of more general population, healthy patients, or are there vulnerable patients to be included? That has to go into our consideration, both of the ethics as well as how rigidly and how carefully we have to control and monitor the therapies. And we also have to think about the usual settings. Where will patients be receiving this care when the drug is approved? Is it similar to the settings in which the drug was studied in phase 3? Will there be different settings? And does the setting impact the outcome? We know that for some treatments, whether it's managed by a subspecialist, by a specialist, by a generalist, the outcomes aren't all that different. And so in other settings, it really does matter. So do we think that the outcome is affected by where care is delivered? And I think that's another important question. I mentioned the regulatory intent. What is the purpose of the study with regard to the regulatory intent? We have specific parameters that we're looking for in what's submitted to us. If it's looking to get a new indication or to expand an indication, then how the treatment is administered will be important to us. We'll want to make sure we understand that it's appropriately administered, the comparative treatment is appropriately administered, so we can make conclusions regarding relative efficacy. That will be important. If it's not for regulatory purposes, it's for practice or for an economic modeling effort, then that has obvious implications in terms of how treatment quality would be implemented. And finally, the study design elements. Is this a cluster randomized trial? Is it an individual randomized trial? Clearly, that will also have an impact. Is the entire hospital or institution managing the care of this treatment, or is it being managed by individual practices with different practices, with individual practices managing both of these treatments that are being compared in a comparative trial? Is the goal in non-inferiority design? We know that in medications where we're not as carefully implementing it, it tends to lead non-inferiority towards the null. So if we're looking for non-inferiority and trying to get a robust conclusion out of that, is that appropriate if treatment quality isn't at a higher level? So just a few general observations, and then I think great to hear the discussion around this point. So I think the issues that I think we have to wrestle with are the settings where there is a need for more intensive and careful treatment implementation, treatment quality, that may lead to some sacrifice of generalizability. But again, if that's where care will be, and if it's essential to the outcome of the patient, then we have to make sure that treatment implementation is of highest potential quality. Patient safety is clearly of paramount consideration here. And so that has to be a consideration in what we can allow. Again, with the Coumadin example, inadequate monitoring, inadequate experience of the physician who's administering that can lead to both lack of efficacy or safety issues. And that's not appropriate and not acceptable in the context of any trial that was to be conducted. So we have to think about that consideration as well. And as I mentioned, also the research objective is very much important in our thinking about how the design and how treatment quality would be implemented. I think in general, just a couple of concluding remarks, I think what we're talking about is the trade-off for the balance between the value of generalizability, being able to look to see what we might see in a more general setting, versus our ability to draw conclusions, the adequacy and precision of the estimates we're trying to make. And it does come down both to the context of the setting, the context, as well as the research questions we're trying to answer and the ethical considerations around that. So I'll stop there. Appreciate your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.